And if the war in Ukraine is in the headlines every day, the war in Yemen is often called the silent war, not least because in our Western media, it receives virtually no coverage. And yet it is no less devastating for journalists and journalism than other wars raging around the world, including the fact that we have 4 journalists currently on death row in Yemen. So I'd like to welcome Sami Al Ansi, who is a Yemeni journalist currently based in Sweden, has worked for AFP, for Sky News Arabia, as a video journalist and producer in Yemen, and then was forced to leave in 2015 and currently works as a video reporter for the Swedish public broadcaster SBT. Sami, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. And in order to save time, I would start talking about what's happening in Yemen and what has been going on in Yemen since the start of the war. Since the beginning of the war in Yemen in 2015 until now, the press freedom has been subjected to systematic violence. Nearly 1,450 cases of violations of press freedoms have been recorded by the Yemeni syndicates, journalist syndicates, and like starting with murder, attempt of murder, kidnapping, property seizing, blocking websites, closing newspapers, raiding and shutting down radio stations, and cutting off the salaries of the journalists. During the war, more than 300 journalists were kidnapped and being imprisoned for different periods of time, which can last to several years by both warring parties, the Houthis and the internationally recognized government. But most of the kidnappings were carried out by the Houthi militias. There are more than 200 websites were blocked by the Houthis, as they control the Ministry of Communication and the internet service in Yemen. We have like more than 100 attempts of murders for journalists during the period of from 2015 to this year. So far, we have recorded, according to the statistics, we have 44 journalists who have been killed during the war in Yemen. Some of them have been killed by direct shooting by snipers in front of the cameras, like Khalid al-Shaybani, who has been working as cameraman in Taiz, and also Muhammad al-Yemeni, the freelance journalist who has been working in Taiz also. Some of them were killed by landmines. Other were placed as human shields in sites, exposed to airstrikes, such as the journalist Abdullah Qabil and Yusuf al-Aizari, who have been killed in Damar city. There are also those who were killed in a suicide car bombing, and the list goes on. In general, the Yemeni journalists are being targeted by all sides. The Houthi have assaulted, detained, and threatened journalists in the areas that are under their control, and they killed several journalists with mortar and like missile fires. As well as the Yemeni government has also harassed and detained journalists. Let me focus on or talk about the 4 Yemeni journalists who have been detained by the Houthis in Sana'a since 2015 and are now on the death row after being condemned for their work as journalists. And through you, I call on the global journalism community to put pressure on the Houthi authorities to release our colleagues and save their lives. We have Abdul Khaliq Amran, Tawfiq Al-Mansouri, Harith Hamid, and Akram Al-Walidi, who were arrested together with 5 other journalists on June 9 2015 in Sana'a. Their arrest was motivated by their reporting on human rights violations committed by Houthi forces. And the Houthi court sentenced those 4 journalists to death. This is not the first death sentence by the Houthi courts, by the way. Before that, a death sentence had been issued against the journalist Yahya Abdul Raqib al-Jubayhi, who on the pretext of spying. And under pressure, we have under pressure, he was released, but the charges were not dropped yet. Back to our 4 journalists, I would like to talk about their health situation. They have a very catastrophic and very difficult health situation. They are not allowed to take medicines or see doctors. Abdul Khaliq Amran has a spinal injury and he is not allowed to see a doctor. Akram al-Walidi also is a completely ill and he needs permanent medication, but the militia refuses to give him medicines. They are put in an underground prison, which is not healthy environment at all, and being tortured continuously. The Houthi is also hiding them from their families and transferring them from one prison to another for periods of time that lasts for months, while their families do not know anything about them during the transfer. We have information that the Houthi groups wants to exchange those 4 journalists with leaders belonging to Houthi movements. We have heard the testimonies of the 5 colleagues who were released in prisoner exchange recently, and they told us that the torture that was taking place inside the prisons is indescribable. So I think we demand hearing for them by international journalists, also by the IFJ and the human rights organization, to hear their testimonies. Regarding to the journalists who have been forced to leave Yemen, according to our statistics, there are between 700 to 1,000 journalists who have been displaced inside Yemen or outside Yemen in the diaspora. Currently, most of them are currently living in Egypt. The reason behind that is the threat imposed by the warring parties and the killings of the journalists, also the lack of safe working environment and in all region of Yemen. Actually, freedom of speech in Yemen doesn't no longer exist. There are only media outlets and journalists loyal to the warring parties who can only work in Yemen freely during the conflict. I'm an example of those people, of these journalists who have been forced to the country. I have been forced my country in 2015 and moved to Egypt because I couldn't keep working in Yemen because I have received threats to my life, and I have been attacked by armed people, 2 armed men, and I got also my shoulder dislocated after this attack. So I decided to move to work from my exile and keep working about Yemen and on Yemen file. Regarding the Yemeni journalist syndicates, I think we need more international solidarity to keep it steady fast. It has been weakened tremendously, but it is still alive, representing Yemen journalists. The Yemeni journalist syndicates is still operating at its limit capacity, despite the difficulties of that they face in Yemen. It has no headquarters in Yemen since the outbreak of the war in 2015. The syndicate is trying to monitor violations that occur to Yemen journalists on a daily basis, and to communicate with the world through the IFJ, which plays a golden and major role in helping the Yemeni journalists. The syndicates need also to train Yemeni journalists who are still working on the field in Yemen. Like, we need to give them training courses on hostile environment and first aid, HIFAT, for example, as many of the journalists who were killed because they did not know how to work in the war zones areas, or hostile environments. Perhaps they would have had better luck if they had received some training. Yeah, to sum up, I would like to say that things in Yemen haven't got better yet, and we need the UN, the EU, and all governments across the world to stand up for journalists in Yemen, and telling the Houthi militias that attacking, torturing, and executing journalists is a war crime, and that would, should not be tolerated. They should be tolerated as war criminals. I think I have said what I'm trying to say, because we don't have time to talk about specific and much detail. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sami. And people will see that I put in the chat the link to the IFJ's campaign on Yemen, and in particular the 4 colleagues on death row. And we've also put up there the open letter that people can sign. And people should also remember that UK and other governments' supply of weapons during that conflict is helping to fuel the war, and there are plenty of campaign groups in the UK and other countries who are campaigning for an end to supplying military assistance to the forces during that war. So please take a look at the campaign page that we have and take action to support our colleagues in Yemen. Probably one of the most shocking images of this week was the scenes at the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, when Israeli forces attacked the funeral procession, leading to her coffin being dropped and hitting the ground. And it's to Palestine that we'll turn now. Jennifer Robinson QC is one of the world's leading human rights lawyers, and she's well known to the IFJ and the NUJ for her work defending BBC Persian service journalists and being part of Julian Assange's legal team. But along with her colleagues, she's representing the IFJ and the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate in the case that we have submitted to the International Criminal Court, detailing the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists by the Israeli